Okay, so I thought I would look at something different this time that I hope you're going to find interesting. It's the creative, artistic side of mixing, I guess you could call it. I mean, you could say that any part of mixing is creative and artistic, and of course it absolutely is. But what I'm talking about here is the area where you get to really kind of create more, add more to the music. It crosses over into producing, and there is, of course, a fuzzy line between mixing and producing, or can be, depending on the context, and ultimately the two can be completely one and the same thing. So the kind of music I specialize in, jazz, progressive rock, fusion, all those kind of related genres, often has sound design elements in it and creative production elements in it. And sometimes the artists have done all of that work before it's given to me to mix, but quite often I'm asked to do things. Somebody will say, can you create some ambient thing here? Can you create an atmosphere like this or like that? Can you do X, Y, and Z? So I need to have a toolbox of ideas in my back pocket that I can pull out when needed. And although, some artists aren't looking for anything like that, some are, and so I have to have it ready. And it takes a lot of work and development. You can't just come up with that stuff, having never done it before. It takes just as much time and development and developing the techniques as any other part of mixing. And I've worked on these ideas for many, many years, so that I've got a whole range of things from the very subtle to quite extreme ideas that I can, and everything in between, that I can pull out of my back pocket when an artist asks me to do that. So the way I've done that is through working on my own music, because when it's your own music, of course, you can do anything you want. And when I mix my own music, I very much am producing and mixing and arranging all at the same time. So it's a playground for me to experiment with, and has been for many, many years. And that's where I'm able to, have fun and experiment and come up with different ideas, which then end up going into my toolkit of production, sound design ideas, which I can then use on projects for other artists and producers and so forth. And again, if you're working for somebody else, you might want to ask whether they're looking for any input, and if they are, and you hear something that you think might be good, you could then suggest it. What if I try this? What if I try that? What do you think? Would it be worth seeing what happens if I try something? So if you know that the person that you're working with is open to that kind of thing, you can have these ideas floating around in your head, you can hear the music and let it spark off ideas. But again, that's only going to happen if you're kind of used to thinking that way, I find. And with my own music, I'm always thinking that way. And so I'm going to give you a bit of an insight into what went on with me with this particular piece of music, and why I ended up developing the sounds I did, and how I did that using the plugins that I used. And we'll have a look at how all that worked, and what my workflow and my thinking, creative process. So I hope you're going to find that useful and interesting. So this is a track where we'd recorded and I'd done a solo, and I'd played twice through the chord progression, and I'd done it in the kind of expected way, in the sense that here's a chord progression, I'm going to play over it, and what I like to do is paint a kind of story through the chords, tell a story through the chords, and take some melodic ideas and move them across the chords, and kind of get a flow and a story going. And that's kind of how I tend to approach soloing, and so that's what I'd done. In this part, I did feel it still needed more guitar. I just didn't feel it needed more of that kind of playing through the chord changes sort of guitar. So this section has a lot of guitar in it still, but it's a very different approach, and it's something that I've also spent a lot of time working on in my playing career. Basically, it's the wilder side of guitar playing, let's say, and I'm using all kinds of unorthodox techniques on the guitar to create unusual sounds, wild stuff basically, which I love. I love that side of guitar playing. It all started with Jimi Hendrix, and I've kind of taken it into my own area. And I listened to it, and it had a reverb and an echo on it, and I thought, yeah, that sounds okay. But it felt like it was missing something, like it needed something else. Felt like it really needed a soundscape happening. And so that's what we're going to be looking at, is how I did that, how that was generated. And I really wanted that soundscape to come from the guitar. So we'll see how that happens. And I'll talk a bit more about that when we get to that. But to start with, I'm just going to play the track as it was after I did the edit, but before I did any creative mixing. So it goes through the guitar solo and then it goes into this ambient section, and I'll play a little bit of that. I'm not going to play the whole thing, just so you can hear the approach of the guitar. Okay, so let's have a listen to that. So you can hear the approach that I'm taking, and you can hear that there is a delay on there and some reverb, which I thought was fine. It was hinting at something I didn't feel was fully realized though, and which is why I decided to develop more of a soundscapey approach. So I'm just going to play that now, and you can hear, I'm going to go just from the beginning of that section, so you can hear just from there. We don't listen to the whole thing again, and you can hear what it sounds like, and then we're going to go through and I'll show you how I did that. So you can hear it's a lush moving soundscape, and there are many versions of soundscapes you can create, and I've done a huge amount of experimenting with doing this, and there are many ways of creating them. But I knew what I wanted with this. I wanted to pull out certain elements of the tone of the guitar, which was, the tone is quite sort of strident and metallic in a way. Not metallic in terms of heavy metal, but in terms of just you can hear the kind of metal of the strings on the frets with a particular guitar sound, and I wanted that to kind of resonate out. And I also wanted a lot of width and depth front to back, and I wanted a lot of movement. So here's what I did. I started with this here, and what I'll do is we'll just have a listen to this on its own and see what we get with this. So, what have we got here? We have got tape echoes from Softube. Now, I love this delay. It's not very versatile in terms of what you can do with it. It does what it does. It emulates a tape delay really closely, a multi-head tape delay. And I just really like the sound of it. Tape delay has a certain lushness and kind of softness to it. So why did I do that? Well, I wanted to break up the guitar a bit. I didn't want those, because the next thing that's going to happen is a kind of reverb thing, which is coming from this. And I just didn't want the exact notes of the guitar coming into this reverb and then that's all you would get to create the soundscape. I wanted more, so I wanted those notes to kind of repeat and overlap and things like that, so that you're getting much more of a kind of diffuse, lush doubling, tripling of the sounds of the guitar before it goes into the reverb. Now this reverb, this is an interesting one. I have many different reverbs. I'm a real connoisseur of reverbs, and I love what you can do in terms of soundscapes with reverbs. And there's a real difference between realistic sounding reverbs and reverbs that are good at soundscapes. There's some crossover there, but I find many of the reverbs that sound fantastic as soundscapes aren't the most realistic sounding ones when you use them like that. And some of the most realistic sounding reverbs don't actually create great soundscapes when you create a long reverb time. This one here is actually free. And although I've got lots of other brilliant sound design reverbs, this one just has a thing it does, which is really nice. They all sound different. They all bring something different to the table when it comes to soundscapes. And this one just has its own unique thing. Doesn't work for everything, but for this, it brought out the tonal bits I wanted to hear. And I tried several of my kind of go-to sound design reverbs, and then I put this one on, and it's like, okay, this is just pulling out exactly the bits that I want. I'll bring this in, and you can hear what it does. So it's bringing out that sort of metallic, like I was talking about, the metallic edge of the guitar. Those tones are kind of slightly cold metallic edge, which is really what I was looking for. It's not what I call warm and lush, but I wasn't looking for that because I was going to do that with a different part of the sound design. For this particular bit, I wanted to bring out those metallic, ghostly kind of bits, and I wanted those to kind of ring out. So that's exactly what I got from this. I often find that if you get the right tool for the job, you don't need to do too much tweaking, and that's what I got with this. So now that was great, but I felt it sounded a little bit too clinical. So what I did was I put this on it. I thought, well, it needs something. So tape, a little bit of tape saturation. I could have used any kind of saturation, but what I like about tape saturation for this is it's very smooth and kind of lush and smooth, whereas a lot of kinds of saturations, when you put it on something like a soundscape, which is like a sustaining, quite complex sustaining sound, you get kind of a gritty. I know grit is used to mean like almost anything these days. It's kind of synonymous with warmth these days, grit. It's kind of one of these ubiquitous terms that any kind of saturation is called added grit. But to my mind, grit is something you get in your eye or something you get in your shoe. It's something that you don't necessarily want in everything. You might want it sometimes, but not all the time. And for me, most saturation, I would find by the time it was kind of doing what I wanted, you'd get a little bit of that kind of rough-edged texture. I really didn't want that. Now, I know other saturations that have a lot of variation, and I'd probably find something that, really smooth that worked like that, but I know that tape just does that. That's the tape sound. So I thought, well, I'll go for a tape emulation, and I thought, well, this is another free one from UAD, and it doesn't give you much variation, just drive, but I didn't want much. I just wanted a little bit of smoothness, a little bit of I wanted it pulled back into something a little bit something a little bit rougher, a little bit like less kind of clinical sounding. And this did it for me. Subtle effect, but I'll take it out and then bring it back in. Do you hear what I mean? It kind of like smears it a little bit and kind of degrades it, but just ever so subtly. It sounds kind of like, you know, it's going through some older machines that are slightly, you know, degrading it a little bit, which is exactly what I wanted. I didn't want it to distract. I wanted it to fall into the background of, like, you know, yeah, there's kind of machines going on here almost behind all of this, but not ultra modern ones. Anyway, this is getting pretty subjective now at this point, but you get the idea. It created the effect that I wanted. Now, that wasn't enough. I needed some more. So I fed, and the way I got the guitar into this is I simply sent it to an effects bus with these on it, these things on it. And I then sent it again to another effects bus. And this time I put a different soundscape straight onto it, which is called Butterfly Effect from Sound Better. And this is a really, really nice effect. It's the only plugin that they do, but it's really great. It basically, in one plugin, it does stuff that I was using like 3, 4 or 5 plugins to do. I mean, I often did things just like what this plugin does, but it's just so much easier to just pull this up because you've got all the stuff that, you know, a bit of granulation, a bit of saturation, a bit of shimmer if you want it, and then it goes into a couple of different reverbs that do slightly different things, and some modulation in there. And you know, these are all things that I, you know, would do with different plugins. And of course, this has its own unique sound. That's a really, really nice sound. But it's unique, and I tried various ones, and I tried this one and thought, okay, yeah, this is the one. So I'm going to pull out the other plugins I've got here and then just play this so you can hear what it's doing. So you can hear, compared to the other one, it's much kind of denser and kind of, I wouldn't call it grainy exactly, but it's got a kind of rougher texture to it. It sounds even, yeah, more somewhat industrial in a way to me, which I really loved and thought was great, and it mixed nicely with the other. So I'm going to bring in both of them now so you can hear what they sound like together. So you can hear that it's got that kind of metallic thing from the first soundscape, but now it's got this bed of much kind of denser, more, to me it sounds more like concrete somehow, you know, like rough concrete walls kind of down underneath it. But I felt it was too static, and I wanted it to move around, and I wanted to move around in, you know, the left to right soundscape. There's a lot of front to back going on, but I didn't feel there was enough left to right. And so I used the Steinberg built-in auto pan. And the reason I use this is because it's got a random function in it. And it's actually quite hard to find a pan that's got a random function in it. I'm sure there's some out there. If anybody knows another one that has a random function like this, so that it randomly changes the panning pattern, do leave it in the comments. I'd love to know what else is out there that does this. I thought maybe Melda does, but it didn't mention that in the blurb. So, but you know, maybe it does have that in there somewhere. But if anybody knows one, especially one that's kind of quick and easy to use, I love Melda's products, but they can be quite time-consuming to to get a sound. And sometimes you're in a creative flow like this and you know what you're after and you want it quickly because you're in a flow. You don't necessarily want to spend 20 minutes fiddling with parameters. You just want something, a tool that you know already does the job. And I knew this one did this. So anyway, this did it and it sounded great. I fiddled with the controls so I got it about right. So you can hear what this is like with the panning. So you can hear there's a lot of panning going on, kind of randomly panning, but the whole thing isn't panning, which would have been too jarring and distracting because the other soundscape is not panning. It's sitting there dead center, and only this one is panning. So yeah, and that's what I was after. And then I put this same tape thing on it. I didn't felt it needed in the same way, but it helped it become part of the other one. And finally, I felt it just needed a little bit more modulation going on. So I put this Quick Muse on it, and I love this thing. It's from Universal Audio, and it's a kind of, it randomly generates modulation basically, and it's got like, I don't know exactly what these things are. It's kind of like a saturation, couple of different modulations. I think it's got sort of some kind of reverb thing going on, and maybe some filtering. I'm not sure what each of these represent, because what you do is you press the randomize button in the middle and it randomly randomizes them all, and then you can kind of change the amount of each of them or turn them off and on or randomize each of them separately, but you don't really know what's going on under the hood. And normally I would not like that kind of thing. I like to know exactly what's going on and be able to see what's happening and be able to, but this thing just sounds so great. I don't know what magic they've done with this thing, but it always just sounds great to me. What the trouble I have with most modulation plugins that use these kind of effects is I can always kind of hear, oh, that's a chorus stuck with some saturation, stuck with a bit of this and a bit of that, and it always sounds a bit like not more than some of its parts. This one, it just somehow does sound like more than some of its parts. It just always sounds like a really lush, beautiful modulation without sounding like, oh, I've stuck a chorus on that followed by something else. Okay, so let's have a listen to this before and after. I'll take it out and then I'll bring it in. You hear how it just gives it kind of a lush, kind of living, alive kind of thing going on? Yeah, this is a fantastic plugin. But of course, once you've done your randomization, you can then save a preset, which is great. So I did all of this and I thought, this sounds good, but it's not enough. It needed some low frequency content. So what I did was I took the first soundscape, the one that didn't pan, or no, I actually took the one that panned. That was the one that I felt was going to give me the right low frequency content. Then I fed it into some pitch shifters. I fed it into this one, Auburn Sounds Inner Pitch. Every pitch shifter I find gives a different tonal effect. This one sounded really great, pitch shifting down. It's an absolute CPU hog though. I mean, it's great sounding, but it will absolutely kill your CPU. It's by far the most CPU hungry pitch shifter I've ever come across. But it does sound really good. So I had to actually print that. I couldn't use this while I had the rest of the mix up and running with all the other plugins, which is unusual for this machine I have. I normally don't ever need to do that. But I did with this, so I printed it, and then I ran it through a bunch of other things because I wanted to bring the pitch down even more. And what I find is that if you bring the pitch down more than a certain amount with the same plugin, you start getting artifacts. But if you use a different pitch shifting plugin, you won't get the same artifacts happening, and so it's less noticeable. Those artifacts become less noticeable. So I usually do a bit with one pitch shifter, and if I need more, I'm going to use a different pitch shifter. But before I hit the second pitch shifter, I decided I needed to limit it because it was moving up and down quite a bit in level, and I wanted it to sit there like a really solid thing as much as I could. So I ran it through this limiter, which is really a great limiter, and I thought it would be good at kind of adapting to the changing frequency content, because that's what it does. It kind of dynamically adapts, and it did a great job of that. So I limited it with that pretty heavily, and then I ran it through this, which is just a high pass and low pass filter, because I didn't want all the high frequency content that was left. I just wanted the fundamental to be coming through, so I filtered out everything else, and then I put it into this waves pitch shifter, which is another really great pitch shifter. It's very it's an old one, and I never hear people talking about this one, but it for pitching down, it absolutely stupendously great sounding. It's really smooth, really nice, and you can go a long way with it. So I did this twice and brought the thing down, because if you think about it, there's a lot of high frequency content coming out of that guitar. It's mainly playing high notes, and that's coming to the soundscape. So you're taking a high frequency content, you want to create bass content, you're going to have to bring it down a long way. So another 24 semitones down with these two. And I ended up with this. Which is exactly what I was after. And that sits under the rest of it. So that's my soundscape. And now I will play it in context. So you can hear, to me anyway, it gives the whole thing a real kind of urgency and drive, because everything the guitar is doing just feeds into this kind of momentum, this kind of avalanche of kind of wall of sound coming behind it, pushing behind it, that's being fed by it. And to me that just gives the whole thing a real momentum, and I thought it worked nicely for me. Of course, it might be way out there for you, and you might think, what on earth is this? That's fine. Again, this works for the music I'm doing. But the takeaway I hope for you is just that these are techniques that you can develop, and it's only by messing about and having a playground like this, which could be your own music or could just be simply you sitting around and just experimenting without any particular goal in mind, is how you develop these things. Now, I probably wouldn't use anything like this, something this extreme in work for another artist, but I might well use something like this in a much more subtle way off in the background, or something that was, the same idea, but more subtle and less extreme. So I hope this was interesting and useful. I mean, this is a huge area you can explore. These are just some techniques of many, many different techniques. But I hope it kind of sparks your imagination and maybe inspires you to do some experimenting yourself. And yeah, hope you found it useful. If you did and you found it interesting, useful, helpful, please do give the video a like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And if you can press the thanks button, that's also really helpful to keeping it going, and hope to see you next time.